Europe hadn't fully awakened yet. The sky was a vague, indistinct color, somewhere between blue and gray. Dawn was faintly appearing on the horizon, the last remnants of night slowly fading away among the majestic buildings. In this medieval English inn, there was no concept of time. No one said, "It's morning." Morning arrived imperceptibly. The coals in the fire pit still glowed red. Smoke rose like a thin mist between the wooden posts, brushing against the ceiling before falling back down. Heavy breathing echoed on the straw mattresses on the floor. Some travelers wrapped themselves more tightly in their blankets, while others simply turned and lay down. Outside, the wind swayed the fences. The rusty hinges on the inn door creaked slightly. It wasn't strong enough to wake anyone. It was merely a faint sign that the night was over. No one was in a hurry, because in this world, no one woke up in the morning. The inn was slowly losing the warmth that had accumulated overnight. The stone walls drew in cold air, and the shards of glass in the windows fogged up. The oil lamps were almost extinguished, their wicks flickered, their light dancing with shadows in the corners of the room. A horse saddle hung loosely by its strap in one corner. A half-empty beer mug sat on a table, leaving a dull mark on its surface. Wet cloaks hung from the rafters, small drops falling beneath them. The sleeping people were no longer distinguishable individually. They were all in the same slow rhythm. Breath, silence, the coldness of the stone. Morning didn't begin noisily. Morning approached imperceptibly, and everyone in the inn, merchants, travelers, drivers, soldiers, was moving towards a new day without realizing it. Soon footsteps would be heard. The fire would be rekindled. The door would open, cold air would rush in. But not yet. Right now, there was only the end of sleep. The first stirrings of morning, the dissolution of sleep. The inn was still dark, but it no longer belonged to the night. There was a heavy weight to the shadows, but they weren't harsh. Light filtered in through the edges of the windows, creating faint lines on the stone floor. A traveler turned gently. His blanket slipped from his shoulder and fell to the floor. He shivered but didn't wake. Another took a deep breath. The straw bed creaked softly. A dusty bag lay beside the boots of a man lying in a corner. The bag was open. Scraps of fabric, spools of rope, and a small metal container were visible inside. The order from the previous night remained undisturbed. No one had tried to gather their belongings. The coals in the fire pit were still a pale red. Sometimes a faint crackling sound was heard, followed by silence again. These sounds didn't wake anyone. They only whispered that sleep was fading. The dampness dripping from the thick beams of the ceiling swayed gently before falling to the floor. Each drop was like a small measure of time in the inn's morning. There were no rooster sounds from outside, because this inn was a little outside the village. The fields were shrouded in fog. The fences, ditches, and dirt roads were not yet visible. People were still in the darkness of the night, but the night was slowly receding. The morning didn't say wake up to anyone. It only changed the environment. First, movements. The light falling on the stone walls gradually intensified. The blue began to turn to grey, and the grey to a pale yellow. The air inside the inn changed with this shift. A man seemed about to sit down, but then changed his mind. He rested his head back on the hay bale. A woman lying nearby pulled her blanket up to her neck. A child stirred, wrapped in his mother's cloak. Shoes were lined up by the door. Their wet soles had dried overnight, their leather hardened. An overturned plate lay on the table, crumbs remaining on its edge. The last of the oil flickered in the lamp hanging in a corner. The innkeeper was not yet visible. The kitchen door was closed. The pots and pans were silent. The knives remained in their places. But soon everything would change. A jug would be lifted, new wood added to the fire, the door opened, and the cold morning air would enter. For now we are only waiting. In medieval England, morning came slowly and undisturbed, not with noise. The inn's slow awakening, the return of sounds. The morning light was no longer just a streak, but filtered through the narrow openings of the windows, spreading across the stone walls, and leaving faint streaks on the floor. There was still fog outside, but the air entering was now colder and fresher. A traveller straightened up and took a deep breath. His joints felt frozen as he moved his shoulders. He pulled the hem of his cloak around his knee to keep it from touching the ground. Another pulled a bag closer to himself, a movement before sleep. People protect their belongings even in their sleep. The old man sitting in the corner coughed. The sound wasn't loud and didn't echo off the wall. It was as if the inn had absorbed the sounds. The deep breaths of the horses coming from the stable could be heard. From behind the closed doors, smooth, heavy, and muffled sounds rose. The sound of drops falling into a bucket came, then another. This was now the inn's rhythm. The embers of the fire were still smouldering. Someone poked him without thinking with the tip of his cane. A red gleam appeared for a moment, then faded again. No one spoke. It was too early to talk. English mornings did not appreciate the quiet sounds in inns, for the day had not yet begun. People rose not from bed, but from the night before. Smells and preparations. A door opened. The creaking of heavy wood from the kitchen was the first real movement inside the inn. Then a sound of light footsteps was heard. A woman had her shawl draped over her shoulder. Her hair was braided, but somewhat disheveled. She approached the hearth. She carefully stirred the coals. She added new wood. Smoke rose into the air and curled toward the ceiling. The heat began to shift slowly. A pot moved. Water was added to it. Metal responded with a thin, muffled sound. These sounds didn't frighten people. On the contrary, they made it easier for them to wake up. Fresh bread hadn't been made yet, but the smell of barley porridge was already spreading through the air. Dried meats hung from a hook. Bundles of onions and garlic were beside them, tied with ropes. A traveller sat down. He buried his face in his hands and remained like that for a while. Then he stood up. Taking his boots in his hands, he began to tie them silently. A child opened his eyes and looked at his mother. His mother nodded. A little more. Han was waking up now, but he wasn't in a hurry. The day hadn't yet woken everyone. In the mornings he would first go to the kitchen, then to the stable, then to the tables, and finally to the roads. It was always like that, in that order. The inn's large gate rarely opened quickly at this hour of the morning. First, the lock was opened. The metal scraped against the wood, making a small, muffled sound. Then the gate slowly opened. The wood, holding the dampness of the night, creaked. Not a thin sound, but a deep, thick one. The air that entered when the gate was ajar was different. It was no longer cold, but it had a sharp coolness. It carried the smell of earth, wet grass, wood, and the smoke from a chimney burning in the distance. Mist filled the courtyard. Just outside the inn gate, the silhouettes of horses appeared. Their necks bowed, they seemed to be waiting for their morning feed. A stable door opened. Hay was dragged. The stalks rustled on the stone floor. A traveller stood beside the door. He pulled his cloak tighter around himself and took a deep breath. The morning on the English roads was silent. Neither the market had begun, nor the church bells tolled, nor the carriages moving. Only preparations were underway. A coachman checked the wheel. She ran her fingers over the circle. Was it wet or loose? A woman pulled her child closer. She adjusted her shawl. Nobody was in a hurry. Morning slowly called people to life. Passengers in the mist. A bucket was full in the courtyard. The well's chain was slowly pulled upwards. The metal struck the stones. The sound of dripping water was heard. A man washed his face. He covered his eyes with his hands. He didn't open them for a long time. Another man checked his saddle. He examined the straps and pulled the buckles. A horse neighed with a short, soft sound. The mist enveloped everything. The trees looked like blurry shadows in the distance. The fences looked like straight lines. The inn sign swayed slightly in the wind. The paint on it had faded. A lion or a deer was no longer clearly visible. A merchant was pushing his chest to the side of the cart. The wheel got stuck in the mud. It paused for a moment. Then it slowly moved. A monk stood aside. He had his head bowed. He had his hands inside his robe. People were silent. There was no need to talk. The first light of day was enough to illuminate the streets. English mornings begin with fog, then life becomes visible. Passengers in the mist. A bucket was full in the courtyard. The well's chain was slowly pulled upwards. The metal struck the stones. The sound of dripping water was heard. A man washed his face. He covered his eyes with his hands. He didn't open them for a long time. Another man checked his saddle. He examined the straps and pulled the buckles. A horse neighed with a short, soft sound. The mist enveloped everything. The trees looked like blurry shadows in the distance. The fences looked like straight lines. The inn sign swayed slightly in the wind. The paint on it had faded. A lion or a deer was no longer clearly visible. A merchant was pushing his chest to the side of the cart. The wheel got stuck in the mud. It paused for a moment, then it slowly moved. A monk stood aside. He had his head bowed. He had his hands inside his robe. People were silent. There was no need to talk. The first light of day was enough to illuminate the streets. English mornings begin with fog, then life becomes visible. The rhythm of morning as I sit. Footsteps began to be heard in the courtyard, but they weren't fast. Even the feet of those walking felt heavy on the ground. A man entered through the door. His cloak slipped from his shoulder. Another pulled out a chair. It made a slight sound on the wooden floor. A bowl was placed on the table. Steam rose from it into the air. A wooden spoon stirred the bowl. In one corner, two people bowed their heads in greeting, without speaking. A dog curled up by the door, seeking a suitable place to warm itself. The innkeeper stood behind the counter. He began to arrange the cups. His hands moved slowly. The ledger was still unopened. The light from the window illuminated the dust in the air. They floated slowly in the air. As the fog outside melted, the morning's atmosphere was taking shape inside. An inn morning in England, it couldn't begin all at once. It would come in pieces, with fire, with bread, with footsteps, and people would adapt to this rhythm. The inn was now fully lit, but the light wasn't very distinct. The sun had risen, but it wasn't in a hurry. The light streaming in through the windows created large patches on the walls. The scratches on the tables were beginning to show. There were traces of spilled candles, bowls laid side by side, a broom standing in a corner. Everything no longer belonged to the night, but it wasn't day yet either. An attendant placed bread on the tables. Thick slices. It had a hard crust, but the middle was warm. A knife slowly cut the bread. Snap, then another. A piece separated. A traveler waited to spread butter. As the bread warmed, the butter melted and dripped down. A cup was placed on the table. Steam rose from it. Barley porridge. The smell of honey, the smell of damp woolen cloaks. Smoke, wood, warming stone. It all came together. A man moved his chair a little closer to the fire. She stretched out her legs but didn't take off her boots. She only loosened them slightly. A woman went to the window and looked outside. The fog still hung over the road. It was impossible to see beyond the fence, but it was clear that morning had arrived. Birds had begun to chirp in the distance. It wasn't very loud, more like a remembrance of the tranquility within the inn. No one spoke loudly. Everyone was trying to adjust to the day. In one corner, a man opened his bag. He loosened the buckles. He pulled out a piece of cloth. He folded it. He put it back in. Another checked his belt. He looked at the holes, as if thinking, which one fits? Then he put it back in the same place. A pair of gloves was left on the table. The leather was cracked. It had been dried. It had clearly come a long way. An attendant filled the pitcher. The stone container made a sound as it filled. The water hit the stone and echoed. Another attendant took the broom. He swept the floor slowly so as not to raise dust, with small, careful movements. The door opened for a moment. Cold air came in, followed by dampness. A horse neighed outside. From a distance, the saddle strap was pulled, the leather creaked, the iron rings of the carriages clanged together. But still, so far so gentle, it didn't disturb the rhythm inside the inn. A traveller stood by the door. He seemed ready to set off, but he was waiting for the last sip in his cup, for the last warmth of the fire, for the day to begin properly. An inn morning in England. It didn't flow quickly. It widened. It stretched. It didn't rush you. The road wasn't calling yet. The activity inside the inn had become noticeable, but it was still slow. No one suddenly got up from their seat. No one said, "Let's go." Only chairs were pulled back slightly. Bags were placed on the floor. Cloaks were dropped from shoulders. Buckles were fastened. A man bent under the table to tighten his bootlaces, then loosened them again for more comfort. A woman adjusted her shawl, wrapping it around her neck. She felt a little cold as she moved away from the warmth of the fire. Someone walking towards the door stopped halfway. He turned back, glanced at his cup one last time. There was very little water left. He took another sip, placed the cup on the table, making little sound. Wood had a soft creak at this hour. The attendant placed the logs in the fireplace. A crackling sound was heard, then again a deeper crackling. The coals moved. A brief light appeared, then faded again. Cloaks hung on the hook by the door. One was heavy, made of thick wool. It had travelled a long way. It had been caught in the rain. It carried the smell of fog. A man stopped as he lifted it onto his shoulder. He brushed off the dust. Slowly, as if afraid to make a sound, only crumbs remained on the tables. Bread, barley, frozen traces of honey. The sun had risen a little higher. The windows were fogged up. A traveller traced a small circle with his hand. He wiped the condensation from the glass. He looked outside. The fog had not yet dispersed. The road still seemed as if it belonged to the night, but the birds were now closer, clearer, more constant. A passageway had formed between the inside and outside of the inn. No one had crossed yet. Everyone was standing there, ready but waiting. A person standing in front of the door reached for the doorknob, but they didn't knock. They just touched it. Cold metal. It made them feel the chill of the morning. They withdrew their hand. They took a deep breath. They turned around. Everyone was engrossed in their own business. A belt was tightened. A bag was closed. In the distance, a horse's reins were being fastened. Leather straps rubbed against each other. But the door was still closed. An attendant was closing a ledger behind the counter. The pages closed slowly. He ran his fingers over the ledger as if confirming the start of yesterday's routine. A candle hadn't gone out. It was extinguishing itself. The tip of the wick was blackened. Smoke rose upwards. Then it disappeared. A passenger put on their hood. They covered their ears. It was cold. There was fog. A long journey lay ahead. But they hadn't set off yet. The last warmth that seeped in through the door from the fire, from the wood, from the people was still inside. Outside, the world waited, wet, silent, pale-coloured. The English morning wasn't a call to travel. First, it made one think. It was as if it were saying, stay a little longer, come a little closer to the fire, hold the cup a little longer. And everyone understood this call. Therefore, no one was in a hurry. The door still wasn't opening. The door finally opened, but not suddenly. Nor was it a forceful movement. The wood first creaked softly. Then cold air rushed in, silently and calmly. A gentle passage, not enough to disturb the warmth of the fire. Mist seeped in through the gap in the door. It moved like a thin white veil. The outside was visible, but not clearly discernible. The path was there, but not distinct. The fences, stones and trees all softened and disappeared in the mist. The first person to step in paused. They stepped onto the threshold. The soles of their boots were wet. The wood creaked. Then came the sound of the earth outside, a deeper, heavier sound. Those waiting behind were patient. No one pushed. No one hurried. A woman tightened her cloak. The wind touched her neck. There was a cool air. But it wasn't sharp. It was merely a warning. It gave a feeling as if it were saying, wake up. A horse appeared, steaming from its nose. Then it disappeared again. A child came to the door. He looked around with an expression that sought to understand, with eyes that seemed to say, "Where were we last night? Where are we now?" The inn was receding behind them. The light of the fire was still visible through the open door, a soft orange hue, like a color that didn't want to blend into the day. But time was moving on, and the travelers knew it. The path didn't disappear suddenly. It faded gradually. The first few steps were distinct, then the muddy color blurred. After that, the stones vanished, then the fences, then the details of the tree trunks, and finally the sky. Only the fog remained, and the people walking. The group of travelers wasn't walking side by side. They were moving in single file, not to avoid making noise, instinctively. He preferred the morning to be like this. The sound of footsteps was muffled. The ground was damp. Boots left tracks as they stepped, but after a few seconds, the fog erased them too. The reins of the horses trembled slightly. Metal. It made a deeper sound when it was cold. A man lowered his walking stick to the ground to find the stone, to feel the path. Bird songs were present, but they were invisible. It was as if they were coming from within the fog, not from anywhere on earth, but from everywhere. The roof of the inn was no longer visible. The chimneys, the smoke, it was all left behind, only the people walking and the morning that enveloped them. No one said anything, because the fog made talking unnecessary. It felt as if everything had already been said. The night was over. A daylight hadn't quite begun yet. During this time, people moved slowly. After a while, the light began to change. A slight change, but noticeably so. The color of the fog lightened from white to pale gray. Shadows began to appear. They looked like long, thin, broken lines. A fence reappeared. The trunk of a tree emerged. There was a tire track from last night. The day was slowly reclaiming the world, but not hastily, without asserting dominance over anyone, just making its presence felt. The travelers noticed this. Heads rose slightly. Steps became more defined. Shoulders relaxed. Breaths lengthened. The warmth of the inn was now a memory, but the cold was not the enemy. It was part of the morning. The English countryside was just beginning to awaken. Dewdrops glistened on the hedges. The grass was damp. The earth was dark. The sky was still colorless. But there was a deep blue, silent still, and the travelers felt small in this scene, but they weren't lost. On the contrary, they were right there, because this world was moving at their rhythm. There was no electricity, no clock. No one was in a hurry. There was only people walking, foggy roads, a day waking up, and time itself. And that's why, in that era, mornings weren't just a new day. There was an acceptance, a slow beginning, a world awakening together.